Chapter 6. Truth and Consequences. The bitter price of Caleb's misadventure revealed itself by nightfall. Despite our swift rescue and Hattie's thorough efforts to warm him with hot baths and mulled cider, the telltale rattle in his chest developed with alarming speed. By morning, fever flushed his cheeks while his small body shivered beneath a mountain of quilts. Pneumonia, Doc Wilson pronounced grimly, after listening to the boy's labored breathing. Not uncommon after such exposure. Next 48 hours will tell the tale. The physician's weathered face softened as he noted Joshua's ashen expression. He's young and strong, Hayes. Good chance with proper care. I sent a note to the school board requesting emergency leave, which Reverend Thomas promptly granted. By midday, I had gathered my medicinal supplies and moved temporarily into Joshua's modest ranch house. Propriety might have forbidden such an arrangement under normal circumstances, but frontier practicality trumped social convention when a child's life hung in the balance. Joshua's home reflected the man himself, sturdy, unadorned, yet welcoming in its simplicity. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone hearth dominating one wall. A narrow hallway led to 2 small bedrooms. Joshua insisted I take Caleb's room while he slept on a pallet by the fire, himself maintaining a cot beside his son's bed. For 3 days and nights, we fought the infection consuming Caleb's lungs. I prepared mustard plasters from Hattie's recipe, applying them to his thin chest while Joshua held him steady through painful coughing spasms. We took turns spooning broth between his cracked lips and bathing his fevered body with cool cloths. Words between Joshua and me became functional, reduced to essential communication about Caleb's care. Yet something profound grew in those silent hours of shared vigil, a partnership more intimate than any conversation could have fostered. I learned to interpret the slightest change in his expression, to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, to draw strength from his unwavering presence when my own reserves faltered. On the 4th night, as sleet pelted the windows like thrown gravel, Caleb's fever raged to terrifying heights. His delirious mumblings tore at my heart as he called for his mother, his small fingers clutching at empty air. Joshua knelt beside the bed, one large hand enveloping his son's, whispering reassurances I couldn't bring myself to interrupt. "Sarah, help me keep him here," I heard him murmur, and turned away from the raw prayer never meant for my ears. Near dawn, the crisis peaked. Caleb's breathing grew so labored that each rattling inhalation seemed certain to be his last. I continued applying cool compresses while Joshua paced the small room, the floorboards creaking beneath his restless steps. Then, as the first pale light crept beneath the cabin shutters, Caleb's breathing eased perceptibly. His fever-bright eyes focused for the first time in days, settling on my face with weary recognition. "Mrs. Wilson," he whispered hoarsely, "you stayed." "Of course I stayed," I replied, smoothing damp hair from his forehead, relief making my voice unsteady. Where else would I be? A hint of his familiar smile touched his lips before exhaustion claimed him again, this time in healing sleep rather than feverish unconsciousness. The frightening flush had faded from his cheeks, and his breathing, while still congested, had lost its desperate quality. "The fever's broken," I whispered to Joshua, who had frozen mid-stride at his son's words. He crossed to the bed in 2 quick strides, laying a callous palm against Caleb's forehead with exquisite gentleness. "Thank God," he breathed, his shoulders sagging as days of tension released their grip. "He'll sleep now," I said, gathering the basin and cloths. "Real sleep, not the fevered kind. It's what his body needs most." Joshua nodded, his exhausted face revealing the toll of constant vigilance. "You should rest too. I'll watch him." "I will if you will," I countered, recognizing in his reddened eyes the same bone-deep weariness that plagued me. "He's past the worst. We can take turns." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Stubborn as ever, Mrs. Wilson." The familiar address, spoken with a hint of his old warmth, lodged in my chest like a physical ache. 2 hours later, after confirming Caleb still slept peacefully, Joshua found me on the small covered porch, wrapped in a quilt against the pre-dawn chill. He offered a steaming cup of coffee, the rich aroma cutting through the crisp air. "Thought you might need this," he said, settling beside me on the rough-hewn bench. I know I do, I accepted gratefully, wrapping chilled fingers around the warm pottery. We sat in comfortable silence, watching pale sunlight touch the snow-covered fields surrounding the small ranch house. In the distance, horses moved placidly in their paddock, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "You risked your life for my son," Joshua said finally, his deep voice barely above a whisper. The raw emotion in those simple words pierced my careful defenses. I couldn't bear to lose him. The honest admission surprised us both, revealing far more than I had intended about my feelings for Caleb, and by extension for his father. Joshua turned toward me, his gaze direct in a way it hadn't been since Christmas Eve. "Ellie," he said, using my Christian name for the first time since I'd rejected his courtship. "Whatever's holding you back, whatever shadows you're running from, they don't matter to me." My heart constricted painfully at the generosity of his offer. Acceptance without explanation, trust without justification. If only it were that simple. But the telegram, Mrs. Foster's suspicions, the lawyer from Boston? My past was circling ever closer, threatening to destroy everything I held dear in Redemption Creek. In that moment, watching dawn light illuminate Joshua's exhausted but earnest face, I made my decision. No more lies. No more evasion. Whatever the consequences, he deserved the truth. "Tomorrow," I said quietly, "when Caleb's stronger, there's something I need to tell you both." Fate, however, had other plans. The following morning, with Caleb propped up on pillows and taking his first proper meal in days, a knock at the door interrupted our quiet celebration of his improvement. Joshua opened it to reveal Reverend Thomas, his breath clouding in the cold air, concern etched across his normally serene features. "Sorry to intrude, Joshua," he said, stepping inside and removing his hat. "How's the boy?" "On the mend, thank the Lord," Joshua replied, gesturing toward Caleb, who offered a weak wave from his bed. "Good news indeed," the minister nodded, though his troubled expression remained. His eyes found mine where I sat beside Caleb's bed. "Mrs. Wilson, I thought you should know. There's a gentleman in town asking questions. A distinguished-looking lawyer from Boston." The spoon I'd been using to feed Caleb clattered against the bowl. "A lawyer?" My voice emerged higher than intended. Reverend Thomas nodded grimly. "Says he represents a prominent family searching for their daughter, name of Montgomery." The room tilted momentarily, forcing me to grip the edge of Caleb's bed for support. From the corner of my eye, I caught Joshua's sharp intake of breath, but he remained silent, his gaze steady upon my face. "He's at the hotel now," the minister continued, seemingly oblivious to my distress. "Mrs. Foster's been quite helpful to him, I understand. Mentioned something about correspondence with acquaintances in Massachusetts. Thank you for letting me know, Reverend," I managed with remarkable composure, considering the roaring in my ears. "I should return to the boarding house soon, as Caleb is improving. Perhaps I'll encounter this gentleman there." After the minister's departure, an awkward silence descended. Joshua busied himself stoking the fire while I helped Caleb finish his broth, aware of Joshua's careful avoidance of my gaze. The confession I had planned now seemed pointless. Events had overtaken my belated honesty. That evening, after Caleb had drifted to sleep and Joshua had stepped out to tend his livestock, I gathered my few belongings. The midnight train would carry me further west, perhaps to Oregon or California, where I could establish yet another identity beyond my father's reach. The thought brought no relief, only a hollow ache where hope had briefly blossomed. At the small writing desk in the corner of Caleb's room, I penned 2 painful letters. The first to Joshua explained everything. My true identity, the arranged marriage I had fled, my growing feelings for him and Caleb that made the deception increasingly unbearable. The second, to Caleb, promised my continued prayers for his health and education, assuring him that our work together had been one of the greatest joys of my life. I sealed both with shaking hands, placing them propped against the lamp where Joshua would surely find them upon his return. Then I knelt beside Caleb's bed for one last moment, memorizing his peaceful face, allowing myself to brush a gentle kiss against his forehead. "Goodbye, dear one," I whispered. Back at the boarding house, I packed my small bag with efficiency born of practice, leaving most of my modest possessions behind. The few precious items I had brought from Boston, Mother's Bible, her silver hairbrush, the portrait miniature of her that had been my constant companion, went into the bag along with one spare dress and basic necessities. Before departing, I knelt beside the narrow bed that had been my home these past months. "Lord," I whispered into the darkness, "I don't know where to go. Show me the path." As my prayer faltered into silence, my mother's favorite verse echoed unbidden in my mind. "Perfect love casts out fear." The words hung in the stillness of the room, a challenge and a promise intertwined. What was I doing? Running again? Creating yet another false identity? Abandoning the people who had come to matter more than my own safety? What kind of life could I build on such a foundation of fear and falsehood? I remained on my knees until the first pale light of dawn streaked the eastern sky. When I finally rose, it was with a different purpose entirely. The early morning air bit with fierce cold as I walked the mile to Joshua's ranch, each step crunching in the frozen snow. Birds called tentatively from ice-laden branches, their morning songs muted by the stillness that follows a storm. I found Joshua on his porch, a steaming cup clutched between his hands, staring out at the pinking horizon. He showed no surprise at my appearance, merely shifting slightly on the bench to make room beside him. "I thought you might have left town," he said quietly. "I almost did." I remained standing, needing the distance to summon my courage. "I packed my bag and wrote you letters explaining everything. I planned to catch the midnight train." "What stopped you?" I took a deep breath, the frigid air searing my lungs. "The truth stopped me. I'm tired of running, Joshua." The words began pouring out, unstoppable as spring meltwater. "My name isn't Ellie Wilson. I'm Eleanor Montgomery from Boston. I wasn't widowed. I fled an arranged marriage to a cruel man who only wanted my inheritance." His expression remained carefully neutral as I continued my confession, detailing my father's financial troubles, Maxwell Harrington's threats, Martha's help in planning my escape, and my journey west under a false identity. "I've lied to you, to Caleb, to everyone in Redemption Creek. I'm so sorry." My voice finally broke on the apology. "I never intended to stay long enough for it to matter. I never expected to care so deeply about the people here, about you and Caleb especially." The silence stretched between us as Joshua's face remained unreadable, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he set his cup aside and rose to face me. "Are you finished?" he asked, his voice even. I nodded, bracing myself for his righteous anger, his sense of betrayal, his disgust at my deception. "I knew," Joshua said simply. Of all possible responses, this was perhaps the only one for which I was completely unprepared. "You knew?" "Not everything, but enough. Sheriff Daniel showed me the telegram weeks ago. Your reaction that day confirmed my suspicions." Disbelief rendered me momentarily speechless. "You knew? And still offered to court me?" "I figured you had your reasons," he replied with a slight shrug. "Trusted you'd tell me when you were ready." The quiet dignity in his response humbled me more thoroughly than any recrimination could have. This good man had known I was living a lie, yet had offered his heart regardless, waiting patiently for me to trust him with my truth. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes. "Was any of it real, Eleanor? Your feelings for Caleb, for me? Everything except my name was real," I whispered, finding courage in his steady gaze. "Especially how I feel about both of you." Something in his expression softened, the beginning of forgiveness I scarcely deserved. But before he could respond, the sound of an approaching carriage interrupted our fragile moment of honesty. Through the frost-edged window, I glimpsed a handsome black brougham advancing up the snowy lane. Mrs. Foster's distinctive figure seated beside a well-dressed gentleman in a top hat. "They've found me," I breathed, instinctive panic rising in my throat. Joshua's hand found mine, warm and reassuring. "You don't have to face them alone." Together, we stepped onto the porch as the carriage drew to a halt. Mrs. Foster's expression of anticipated triumph faded slightly at finding us standing side by side, my hand still clasped in Joshua's. The gentleman who descended from the carriage bore little resemblance to the authorities I had feared. Middle-aged, with distinguished silver temples and wire-rimmed spectacles, he carried himself with the quiet assurance of wealth and education. "Miss Montgomery, I presume," he said, removing his hat and bowing slightly. "I am Elliot Chambers, attorney at law." "Mr. Chambers," I acknowledged, struggling to maintain composure. "I assume you've come to return me to Boston." "That depends entirely on your wishes, Miss Montgomery," he replied with unexpected gentleness. "I represent your maternal grandmother, Mrs. Abigail Hartwell." The name struck me like a physical blow. My grandmother? "Very much alive, I assure you," Mr. Chambers countered, his kind eyes reflecting genuine sympathy. "Your father deliberately separated you after your mother's death. Mrs. Hartwell has been searching for you since learning of your engagement to Maxwell Harrington." Mrs. Foster's expression soured further at this development, clearly not the dramatic arrest and disgrace she had anticipated. Mr. Chambers removed a leather portfolio from inside his coat. "Your mother's maiden name was Elizabeth Hartwell, only daughter of Abigail and William Hartwell of Brookline. Your inheritance, the one Harrington sought to control through marriage, comes from your grandmother's estate, not your father's business interests." My legs weakened beneath me as decades of lies unraveled. Joshua's steady hand at my elbow guided me to the porch steps, where I sank down, struggling to comprehend this revelation. "The funds were meant for your independence, miss," Mr. Chambers continued gently. "A trust established by your grandfather before his passing to ensure his granddaughter would never be dependent on any man's charity. Your grandmother never intended for you to be bartered in marriage to save your father's failing bank." Memories surfaced, fragmented recollections of a stately woman with kind eyes who had visited during my early childhood, the woman my father had later claimed was dead, forbidding any mention of her name in our household. "All this time," I whispered. "Your grandmother has been searching for you since receiving an anonymous letter from your lady's maid, we believe, warning of the arranged marriage. When we learned you had fled, we followed your trail westward." Mrs. Foster, clearly disappointed by this turn of events, excused herself stiffly and requested the carriage return her to town. As she departed, Mr. Chambers presented me with a sealed envelope bearing my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. I turned to Joshua, whose face now reflected wonder rather than judgment. "You're free," he whispered, understanding before I did myself the true meaning of these revelations. "Free from my father's control, free from Harrington's pursuit, free from the necessity of living under an assumed identity. Free, perhaps, to begin again. Not as the woman I had pretended to be, nor as the sheltered Boston socialite I had fled, but as someone entirely new. Someone who might, if a certain rancher and his son were willing, build a life founded on truth rather than deception." The letter from my grandmother trembled in my hands, representing a past I had believed lost forever and a future suddenly rich with possibilities I had never dared to imagine. Chapter 7. Reconciliation. The fire crackled in Joshua's stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the modest parlor where Mr. Chambers had spread several documents across the pine table. Outside, the late February sun glinted off melting snow, sending rivulets of water streaming from icicles that hung from the eaves. Inside, the world I had known continued to transform with each revelation. "These are copies of correspondence your grandmother has maintained over the years," Mr. Chambers explained, his Boston accent a startling reminder of the life I'd fled. He handed me a packet of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. "She wrote to you regularly, though your father returned each missive unopened." My fingers trembled as I untied the ribbon, revealing dozens of letters spanning nearly 2 decades. Birthday greetings, Christmas wishes, news of family matters both significant and mundane. An entire relationship denied me through deliberate deception. "I don't understand," I said, looking up from a particularly poignant letter marking my 16th birthday. "Why would my father do this?" Joshua, who had remained a steadfast presence at my side throughout this extraordinary conversation, poured fresh coffee for us all. His quiet support anchored me as revelations continued to shake the foundations of my understanding. "Your mother, Elizabeth, married against her parents' wishes," Mr. Chambers explained, accepting the steaming cup with a nod of thanks. "Not because they disapproved of Edward Montgomery specifically, but because they felt she was too young at 18, they asked her to wait a year to be certain of her choice." I nodded, recognizing my mother's spirited independence even in this decades-old decision. The memories I had of her, gentle yet resolute, kind but never weak, aligned with this account of youthful determination. Your grandmother respected your mother's choice but never stopped loving either of you, Mr. Chambers continued. When Elizabeth fell ill, Abigail came immediately to Boston. She was at your mother's bedside for her final weeks. This revelation struck me like a physical blow. But Father always said she refused to come, that she had disowned Mother after the marriage. Mr. Chambers' expression softened with compassion. I'm afraid your father has a talent for reshaping truth to serve his purposes. After your mother's passing, he systematically severed all connections between you and your maternal family. He claimed custody rights as your father and threatened legal action if the Hartwells attempted contact. But surely as my grandparents... The courts in those days favored fathers absolutely, Mr. Chambers interrupted gently. Your grandfather was already ill by then. Your grandmother chose not to subject you to a painful court battle you would likely witness, but ultimately lose. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of 20 years of unnecessary separation, of a loving grandmother denied her only grandchild, of the relationship we might have had. And now, my father? His financial troubles are real, but entirely of his own making, Mr. Chambers replied, his tone cooling noticeably. A series of increasingly desperate speculations, combined with a lifestyle beyond his means. When your grandmother learned of the arrangement with Harrington, she began searching for you immediately. Will she help him? I asked, uncertain what answer I hoped for. Your grandmother has no intention of rescuing him from consequences of his poor decisions, Mr. Chambers said firmly, particularly given his treatment of you. She believes, as do I, that some lessons are only learned through difficult consequences. I nodded slowly, conscious of conflicting emotions churning within me. Grief for what might have been had my father been honest, anger at his deliberate cruelty in separating me from family who loved me, and beneath it all, a profound relief at breaking free from his control. For the first time since fleeing Boston, I felt the weight of being solely responsible for my own survival begin to lift. Joshua's hand found mine beneath the table, his calloused fingers offering silent comfort. In his steady presence, I found the strength to face these painful truths without being consumed by them. News of my true identity spread through Redemption Creek with the speed of spring floodwaters. By Sunday morning, every resident, from the youngest child to the most elderly grandmother, had heard some version of my story, embellished or diminished according to the teller's inclination. The reactions divided along predictable lines. Some, like Mrs. Foster, seized the opportunity for self-righteous indignation, lamenting the moral decline that would permit a deceptive society girl to teach innocent frontier children. Others, remembering my careful attention to their children's education or my participation in community events, reserved judgment. An impromptu gathering formed after church services, with curious townspeople clustering in the general store, despite Mr. Peterson's half-hearted protests about his establishment not being a public meeting hall. I remained at the edge of the crowd, Joshua's solid presence beside me providing courage to face my neighbor's scrutiny. Seems to me, Sheriff Daniels drawled, leaning against the counter as he addressed the assembled crowd, that we ought to consider what harm's actually been done here. Harm? Mrs. Foster's voice rose indignantly. She lied to us all, used false credentials, pretended to be a widow when she wasn't even married, and taught our children to read and cipher better than they ever have, the blacksmith's wife countered. My Jenny couldn't make sense of fractions before Mrs. Wilson, Miss Montgomery, whatever we're calling her now, took the time to explain them properly. The debate continued, opinions flying like startled birds in every direction. Finally, Reverend Thomas raised his hands for silence. Friends, neighbors, he began, his resonant voice quieting the crowd. Deception is indeed sinful. Our Lord values truth above all things. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. But so is judgment without mercy. Let those without sin cast the first stone. The biblical reference hung in the air, challenging each person to examine their own lives, their own mistakes and compromises. I recall when Jed Wilson there, the Reverend continued, gesturing toward a red-faced man near the pickle barrel, claimed a neighbor's stray calf as his own birthing, and when Thomas Peterson's scale happened to weigh light when selling flour but heavy when buying grain, each pointed example brought embarrassed shuffling of feet. We've all fallen short, he concluded. The question now is not about the past, but the future. Can we, as a community built on second chances, offer one to Miss Montgomery? Sheriff Daniels straightened, hitching his gun belt with deliberate authority. Far as I'm concerned, she's proven her character through actions, not words on paper. I'd trust her with my grandchildren's education without hesitation. The tide of opinion began shifting perceptibly, with more voices rising in support than condemnation. Even Mrs. Foster's most ardent allies seemed reluctant to position themselves against both the sheriff and the minister. 3 days later, I stood before the school board in the same room where I had first presented my fraudulent credentials. The irony of the situation was not lost on me as I faced the 5 members, my hands clasped tightly to prevent their trembling. I request permission to continue teaching, I stated clearly, as Eleanor Montgomery rather than Ellie Wilson. I ask forgiveness for my deception, though not for seeking safety from a forced marriage that would have been its own form of imprisonment. I met each board member's gaze directly, unflinching before their scrutiny. I have come to love this community and its children. If you allow me to continue, I promise to serve them with the same dedication I have shown these past months, only now without the burden of concealment. The board's deliberation lasted mere minutes before Reverend Thomas announced their unanimous decision to retain my services. As I stepped out into the spring sunshine, I found Joshua waiting, his slow smile warming me more thoroughly than the March sun ever could. "So you're like a princess in hiding?" Caleb asked, his young face scrunched in concentration as he attempted to reconcile the various versions of my story he had overheard. We sat side by side on the schoolhouse steps, enjoying the mild afternoon while he recovered his strength after his illness. 6 weeks had passed since the revelations that transformed my standing in Redemption Creek. While whispers still occasionally followed me through town, the majority of residents had adjusted to my true identity with pragmatic acceptance characteristic of frontier communities. "Hardly a princess," I laughed, grateful for his uncomplicated perspective, just a woman who needed to find her own way. Caleb nodded sagely, as though this explanation confirmed his own theories. "Pa says sometimes good people do wrong things for right reasons." "Your father is a wise man," I replied, touched by Joshua's generous interpretation of my actions. "He also says he doesn't care what your name is as long as you stay." Caleb poked at an anthill with a twig, seemingly unaware of the impact his casual words had upon my heart. "Says names are just what folks call you, not who you really are inside." Unexpected tears stung my eyes at this simple distillation of acceptance. "And what do you think, Caleb Hayes?" I asked, my voice catching slightly. He considered the question with endearing seriousness, his dark eyes, so like his father's, narrowed in thought. "I think," he said finally, "that God knew exactly who we needed, even if he sent you with the wrong name. From the mouths of children," I thought, brushing away tears before they could fall. Such wisdom in one so young, offering forgiveness without reservation and acceptance without condition. My grandmother's first letter arrived in early April, carried westward on the same train that had brought me to Redemption Creek months earlier. Her elegant handwriting covered pages with expressions of joy at finding me safe, assurances of her unconditional love, and details of the trust established in my name. "I leave the choice entirely to you, dearest Eleanor," she wrote near the end. "I would welcome you home to Boston with open arms, or support your new life in Colorado, whichever brings you happiness. At 72, I have learned that life is too precious and too brief for anything less than true contentment." I wrote back immediately, describing Redemption Creek, my teaching position, and the community that had embraced me despite my deception. I spoke of Caleb's reading progress and Hattie's motherly kindness. And, with careful honesty, I mentioned Joshua, his integrity, his dedication to his son, his unwavering support through my revelations. Her response arrived with surprising speed, warm with understanding and devoid of judgment. Follow your heart, my dear. I have means enough to travel when my health permits and would dearly love to meet these people who have become so important to you, especially this rancher who seems to hold your affection, though you've tried admirably to conceal it. My grandmother's perceptiveness made me smile. Even across thousands of miles and decades of separation, she had discerned feelings I had barely acknowledged to myself. On a golden afternoon in late April, Joshua and I walked along the creek that gave our town its name. Winter's last traces had vanished, replaced by tender green shoots and early wildflowers that dotted the meadows. The water gurgled over smooth stones swollen with mountain snowmelt, its music a counterpoint to the western meadowlarks calling from newly leafed cottonwoods. "I've written to my grandmother," I told him as we followed the meandering stream. "She's offered to bring me home to Boston." I felt him tense beside me, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Will you go?" he asked, his deep voice betraying nothing of his feelings. "She's also offered to support my staying here," I continued, watching a pair of butterflies dance above the wildflowers. "It's entirely my choice." Joshua remained silent, waiting for me to continue, allowing me the space to find my own answer without influencing my decision. "This place has become home," I said finally, stopping to watch the sun-dappled water. "These people, you and Caleb especially, have helped me find myself in ways Boston never could." "And who is that self?" Joshua asked, taking my hand with gentle firmness. I turned to face him, finding courage in his steady gaze. "Someone who teaches because she loves it, not because circumstances forced her into it. Someone who's learning to be brave, not just in running away, but in staying to face challenges." I drew a steadying breath. "Someone who has discovered that true wealth has nothing to do with Boston bank accounts or social position." Joshua stopped, turning fully toward me, his expression softening with an emotion that made my heart race. "Someone I love," he said quietly, "whatever name she chooses." The simple declaration, spoken without dramatic gesture or flowery language, embodied everything I had come to cherish about this man. His straightforward honesty, his quiet depth, his ability to see beyond surface appearances to essential truths. May unfurled across the Colorado foothills with extravagant beauty. Meadows transformed into tapestries of wildflowers, blue lupins, golden sunflowers, crimson Indian paintbrush, and delicate columbines, creating a riotous display that dazzled the eye after winter's monochrome palette. On the first truly warm Saturday, Joshua suggested a picnic. "There's a special place on the far edge of my property," he told Caleb and me, "perfect spot to welcome spring properly." We set out mid-morning, Caleb running ahead, then circling back with boyish energy, fully restored after his illness. Joshua carried a wicker basket packed by Hattie, who had winked at me with suspicious enthusiasm when delivering it to the boarding house that morning. The meadow, when we reached it after a pleasant half-hour walk, stole my breath with its beauty. Wildflowers stretched in every direction, swaying gently in the breeze beneath an impossibly blue sky. A small stream bordered one edge, and a massive oak tree provided dappled shade for our picnic blanket. "This is magnificent," I breathed, turning slowly to absorb the panoramic splendor. "Found it. My first spring here," Joshua said, spreading the blanket beneath the oak. "Come back every year to see if it's still the prettiest spot in Colorado." "Is it?" I asked, kneeling to help unpack the basket. His eyes met mine, warm with unspoken meaning. "More beautiful each year." We enjoyed Hattie's feast of fried chicken, biscuits, and apple tarts while Caleb regaled us with elaborate plans for his summer fishing expeditions. After eating, he spotted a jackrabbit at the meadow's edge and took off in pursuit, leaving Joshua and me alone beneath the oak's sheltering branches. "Doubt he'll catch it," Joshua chuckled, watching his son's determined chase. "But the trying makes him happy." He's fortunate to grow up with such freedom," I observed. My childhood in Boston was considerably more constrained. "Would you miss it?" Joshua asked suddenly. "The city, I mean, the concerts and shops and whatever else cities offer." I considered his question honestly. I miss certain aspects, good libraries, occasional musical performances, but not enough to trade what I've found here. I smiled at him. Quality matters more than quantity in most things, I've discovered. Joshua nodded, seeming to gather his thoughts. When Caleb's pursuit led him to the far side of the meadow, Joshua rose suddenly from the blanket. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said, an uncharacteristic nervousness evident in his voice. To my astonishment, he lowered himself to one knee before me, taking my hands in his. "Eleanor Montgomery," he began, his deep voice steadied despite the emotion evident in his face. "I've come to love you through lies and truth, through storms and sunshine. I love your courage, your kindness, and even your secrets." My heart thundered in my chest as he continued, his dark eyes holding mine with unwavering certainty. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife and Caleb's mother?" Joy welled within me, so intense it bordered on pain. This man who had every reason to distrust me, to judge my deception harshly, instead offered the very future I had stopped allowing myself to imagine. "Yes," I whispered, my vision blurring with unshed tears. I placed my hands in his, feeling the strength and gentleness in his calloused fingers. "With all my heart, yes." Joshua's smile transformed his usually serious face, creating the same crinkles around his eyes that appeared when he watched Caleb master a difficult task. He leaned forward to seal our promise with a tender kiss that spoke of restraint finally released, of patience rewarded, of a future built on truth rather than illusion. A whoop of joy interrupted our moment as Caleb, having abandoned his rabbit chase, spotted us from across the meadow. He raced toward us at full speed, his face alight with comprehension, even before Joshua could explain. "You asked her," he shouted, launching himself toward us with such enthusiasm that he sent all three of us tumbling backward into the wildflowers. We landed in a tangle of limbs and laughter. Caleb sprawled across us both, Joshua's arm protectively cushioning my head from the ground. The boy's unbridled joy matched our own as Joshua confirmed that yes, Mrs. Wilson, Miss Montgomery, would indeed be becoming Mrs. Hayes. "So, you'll really be my May now?" Caleb asked, his eyes wide with hope as he looked down at me. "If you'll have me," I replied, reaching up to smooth his perpetually unruly hair. "I've been praying for this since Christmas," he confessed, his grin revealing a newly missing tooth. "God just took his sweet time answering is all." Joshua laughed, the sound rolling free and unrestrained across the meadow. "The Lord's timing is perfect, son. Sometimes we just lack the patience to appreciate it." As we lay among the wildflowers, the three of us laughing together in the spring sunshine, I marveled at the journey that had brought me to this moment. From a frightened young woman fleeing an arranged marriage to a bride entering marriage by joyful choice. From Eleanor Montgomery of Beacon Hill to the future Mrs. Hayes of Redemption Creek. I had fled west seeking only escape and safety. Instead, I had found something infinitely more precious. A place to belong, a purpose that fulfilled me, and most miraculous of all, a family formed not by blood but by choice, by understanding and by love, that had withstood the test of truth. Chapter 8. New Beginnings. The train whistle pierced the warm May morning, heralding an arrival I had anticipated with equal measures of excitement and trepidation. I stood on the same platform where I had first stepped into Redemption Creek as Ellie Wilson, a frightened woman in disguise. Today I waited as Eleanor Montgomery, my true self revealed, to greet the grandmother I had believed dead for 20 years. Joshua stood beside me, Sunday suit brushed clean, his quiet strength a balm to my fluttering nerves. Caleb fidgeted at his side, tugging at his collar, more concerned about his uncomfortable formal attire than the momentous family reunion about to take place. "What if she doesn't like me?" I whispered as the train's massive iron form appeared around the bend, belching steam and cinders. Joshua's hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with reassuring pressure. "Impossible," he said simply. The train's grinding halt released a cloud of steam that momentarily obscured the disembarking passengers. When it cleared, I spotted her immediately, a sprightly, silver-haired woman in an elegant traveling suit of deep plum, her bearing regal despite her diminutive stature. Though we had been separated since my early childhood, something in the tilt of her head, the straightness of her shoulders, sparked immediate recognition. Grandmother, I breathed, stepping forward as she scanned the platform. Her eyes, the same clear gray as my mother's, as my own, found mine across the crowded platform. For a moment, time suspended as 3 generations of women looked upon one another across the gulf of years and deception that had separated us. Then her composed expression crumpled into naked emotion. Eleanor, she said, opening her arms. I crossed the distance between us in quick steps, propriety forgotten as I embraced her slender form. The familiar scent of lavender water and fine linen transported me instantly to fragments of childhood memory. A lap where I had once been held, stories read in a melodious voice, a gentle hand stroking my hair. "You look so like your mother," Mrs. Hartwell said, drawing back to study my face, her gloved hands framing my cheeks. "She would be proud of the woman you've become." Tears I could not suppress spilled down my cheeks. "I thought you were dead," I whispered, "all these years." "I know, child." Her eyes reflected my own grief. "Your father has much to answer for, but we are found now, and that is what matters." Joshua and Caleb approached respectfully, allowing us our moment before introductions became necessary. My grandmother's appraising gaze took in Joshua's tall form and steady gaze, Caleb's curious eyes and determined chin. "Grandmother, may I present my fiancé, Joshua Hayes, and his son, Caleb." My voice swelled with pride as I united my past with my future. "My family. Mrs. Hartwell, your presence honors us." "The honor is mine, Mr. Hayes," she replied with matching sincerity. She turned to Caleb, who attempted a clumsy bow that nearly toppled him forward. "And you, young man, must be the excellent student I've heard so much about." Caleb's face flushed with pleasure at being addressed as a gentleman. "Yes, ma'am. Eleanor's teaching me to read even though letters sometimes flip-flop for me." "Intelligence finds its way despite obstacles," my grandmother said, her smile warming further. "My late husband was the same way with his letters. Brilliant man, founder of a shipping company, but couldn't spell worth a continental." Caleb's eyes widened at this revelation, and I saw something ease in his young shoulders, another person of accomplishment who shared his challenge. As Joshua handled my grandmother's trunks and valises, "Enough luggage for a queen," he whispered to me with good-natured teasing. I watched her take in the small frontier town with curious eyes. Not condescending, as I had feared, but genuinely interested in this place that had sheltered her granddaughter. "You've found yourself a fine family, my dear," she said quietly as we walked toward Hattie's boarding house where she would stay until the wedding. "Sometimes we must lose our way to discover where we truly belong." The wisdom in her words touched me deeply. How true that my desperate flight, what had seemed my darkest moment, had led me to my greatest blessing. That evening, after a welcoming dinner at Hattie's where my grandmother charmed everyone with tales of Boston society that somehow managed to mock the pretentiousness while celebrating the humanity of those involved, we sat alone in my small room. The oil lamp cast a golden glow over our heads, bent together over treasured keepsakes. "This was Mother's," I said, opening the Bible that had been my constant companion since leaving Boston. The only thing of hers I dared bring with me. My grandmother's fingers traced the worn leather cover reverently. "I gave this to Elizabeth on her 16th birthday," she said. "Look here." She turned to the front pages, where generations of women had inscribed their names and important dates. My mother's elegant hand recorded her marriage to Edward Montgomery, my birth date, and a final entry made during her last illness. "For my beloved daughter Eleanor, may God's word light your path when I no longer can." Beneath it, in my grandmother's more formal script, "For my granddaughter Eleanor, whom I hold in my heart though we are parted, may you find your way back to those who love you." "You wrote this even when your father prevented my letters from reaching you, yes." She took my hand, her skin papery soft against mine. "Hope is a stubborn thing, Eleanor. It refuses to die even when all evidence suggests it should." Together we added a new inscription that night, my hand steady as I wrote. "For the generations to come, may they know that truth, however painful, leads to freedom. Eleanor Montgomery, soon to be Hayes, Redemption Creek, Colorado Territory, 1874. The legal matters surrounding my identity and inheritance required attention before the wedding could proceed. Mr. Chambers, who had remained in Redemption Creek to assist with these complexities, met with us in Reverend Thomas's study one sunny morning in late May. "I've filed the necessary documents to legally change your name," he explained, passing me papers that required my signature. "You'll officially be Eleanor Montgomery Hayes after the wedding, symbolically keeping your true identity while embracing your future." The name looked strange yet right on the official documents, acknowledging both where I had come from and where I was going. No more hiding, no more pretending to be someone I was not. My grandmother, seated regally on Reverend Thomas's worn leather chair, removed a portfolio from her valise. "I've established a trust in your name," she said. "All business now. The funds are substantial, your grandfather's legacy to you, which I've maintained and grown over the years. Neither Maxwell Harrington nor your father can touch a penny of it." The sum she named caused my breath to catch. Such wealth seemed unreal after months of living on a teacher's modest salary. "What will you do with your independence, my dear?" she asked, watching my reaction closely. Before I could form a response, she continued, "I have a suggestion, if you'll permit it." She withdrew another document from her portfolio. "I'm allocating additional funds to establish a proper library for Redemption Creek and a scholarship for young women seeking education. Eleanor will administer both." Stunned, I looked from the document to my grandmother's determined face. "You're giving me this responsibility?" "Who better?" she smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that reminded me poignantly of my mother. "You understand the value of education and independence better than most. Your experience gives you compassion for those seeking their own path." In that moment, I realized that my painful journey, the deception, the flight, the struggle to establish myself in a new place, had uniquely prepared me to help others find their way. What had seemed merely personal survival now revealed its greater purpose. "I would be honored," I said, accepting both the responsibility and the healing it offered. The weeks preceding the wedding transformed Redemption Creek in ways I had never anticipated. What began as a simple ceremony somehow evolved into a community celebration that united even the most disparate elements of our frontier town. Hattie and the Ladies' Aid Society appointed themselves my wedding planners, spending countless hours sewing me a simple but elegant gown of cream-colored silk that my grandmother had ordered from Denver. The dress, with its modest lace trim and practical styling, suited the woman I had become far better than the elaborate confection my father had commissioned for my aborted wedding to Maxwell Harrington. "No need for all that fussiness," Hattie declared as she adjusted the hemline. "A bride should look like herself on her wedding day, only the best version." Meanwhile, Joshua and the men of Redemption Creek worked tirelessly to expand his ranch house. The original 2-bedroom cabin nearly doubled in size, with the addition of a proper kitchen, a larger bedroom, and most surprisingly, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves built to my exact specifications. "Every teacher needs her books," Joshua explained when he blindfolded me and led me to see the completed room, "and every child deserves access to learning." The shelves stood mostly empty, awaiting the shipment of books my grandmother had already ordered from Boston and Denver, but the potential of the space brought tears to my eyes. Here was a tangible symbol of Joshua's support for my calling, his commitment to our shared vision of education's importance. The most unexpected wedding gift arrived 1 week before the ceremony. Caleb presented me with a hand-carved wooden sign, the lettering painstakingly burnt into the pine surface. "Where every student has dignity." "For the schoolhouse," he explained, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Did I spell it right? I examined the sign, recognizing the hours of practice this must have taken him. Each letter formed carefully, no reversals or omissions, despite his continuing struggle with written language. "Perfectly," I assured him, enveloping him in a fierce hug. The victory contained in those 5 correctly spelled words meant more to me than any expensive Boston wedding gift could have. The night before the wedding, I stood alone in my boarding house room for the last time. The small space had sheltered me through seasons of hiding, discovery, and finally acceptance. Tomorrow, I would leave Ellie Wilson behind forever, stepping fully into my identity as Eleanor Montgomery Hayes. My reflection in the small mirror above the dresser revealed a woman transformed. Not by external circumstances, but by internal growth. I no longer saw a frightened Boston socialite or a woman in hiding, but a teacher, a soon-to-be wife and mother, a woman who had found her true self in Redemption Creek. June sunlight streamed through the church windows in radiant columns, illuminating motes of dust that danced like diamond particles in the golden light. Wildflowers gathered by the schoolchildren brightened every surface, their sweet fragrance mingling with the scent of beeswax candles and freshly polished wood. From my position, just outside the church doors, I could see Joshua awaiting me at the altar, his tall form straight and dignified in his new black suit. Beside him stood Caleb, proudly serving as best man, wearing his first tailored suit with the self-conscious dignity of a boy becoming a young man before his time. "Ready, my dear?" Reverend Thomas asked, offering his arm. I nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the emotion constricting my throat. My grandmother occupied the front pew, her silver hair crowned with a modest hat of lavender silk. Her eyes shining with tears, she made no attempt to hide. As the small church orchestra, comprised of the blacksmith on fiddle, Mr. Peterson with his harmonica, and 3 ranchers with surprisingly musical talents, began the wedding march, I stepped through the doors on Reverend Thomas's arm. The faces that turned toward me represented my journey in Redemption Creek. Hattie beaming with motherly pride, Sheriff Daniels with an approving nod, my students waving excitedly despite their parents' attempts to maintain decorum, and even Mrs. Foster, her pinched expression softened by what might have been reluctant acceptance. But it was Joshua's face that drew my gaze and held it, the naked love and admiration in his dark eyes making me forget everyone else in the small church. The simplicity of the ceremony, so different from the lavish society wedding once planned in Boston, felt perfectly right. No elaborate rituals or excessive pageantry, just 2 people pledging their lives and futures before God and community. I, Eleanor, I spoke clearly, my voice steady with certainty. Take you, Joshua, to be my husband, to have and to hold from this day forward. I promised to be faithful, honest, and true. I emphasized honest with deliberate intent, acknowledging my journey from deception to truth, earning knowing smiles from those who understood the significance of that particular promise. When the time came to exchange rings, Caleb stepped forward with unexpected solemnity, Bible in hand. "I memorized this," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." The verse, so perfectly capturing our family's journey from loss through hope to new beginning, brought fresh tears to my eyes. This child who had struggled so mightily with written words had committed these particular words to heart as his gift to us. "Thank you, son," Joshua said, his voice rough with emotion as he placed his hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Son." The word encompassed us all in its simple acknowledgement of the family we had become. The town square transformed for our wedding feast in a display of community generosity that humbled me deeply. Lanterns hung from trees, their glass chimneys polished to gleaming, long tables draped in borrowed linens overflowed with food, contributions from every household in Redemption Creek, each family offering their finest dishes. Even Mrs. Foster, who had been my most vocal critic, contributed her famous apple pies, the gesture and olive branch I gratefully accepted. The celebration had a distinctly Western flavor that delighted my grandmother, who found herself surrounded by curious townspeople, eager to hear tales of Boston, and equally willing to share frontier stories that made her laugh with genuine pleasure. The cultural exchange happening around punch bowls and platters of fried chicken represented another kind of bridge being built between my past and present, between East and West. As evening shadows lengthened across the square, Sheriff Daniels tapped his glass for silence, rising to offer a toast. "To Joshua and Eleanor Hayes," he called, raising his cup high. Proof that Redemption Creek lives up to its name. The cheer that followed warmed me to my core. This place that had begun as merely a hiding spot had become home in the truest sense. A community where I belonged, not because of birth or wealth, but because of the connections formed through honest interaction and shared purpose. When the fiddler struck up a waltz, Joshua led me into the center of the cleared space for our first dance as husband and wife. His hand at my waist was both respectful and possessive, his steps surprisingly graceful for a man more accustomed to working cattle than ballroom dancing. "Any regrets, Mrs. Hayes?" he murmured, his breath warm against my ear as we turned beneath the lantern light. I looked up into the face of this good, honest man who had seen beyond my deception to the woman beneath, who had offered forgiveness when judgment would have been justified, who had taught me the meaning of true partnership. "Not a single one, Mr. Hayes." Our private moment ended abruptly as Caleb appeared at Joshua's elbow, tugging insistently at his father's sleeve. "My turn to dance with Ma," he announced with the confidence of a boy secure in his place in our family. Joshua relinquished me with a mock bow. "The lady is yours, son." Caleb stood on tiptoes, attempting to reach my shoulders with comical determination. Laughing, I lifted him to stand on my feet, supporting his weight as we swayed together beneath the stars, his delighted giggles the sweetest music imaginable. 1 year later, golden afternoon sunlight bathed the front porch of the Hayes Ranch as I read aloud from Treasure Island, one hand resting on my growing belly, where our child due in less than 2 months performed acrobatics worthy of a circus performer. Each kick and tumble brought a smile to my lips, momentarily distracting me from the adventures of Jim Hawkins. "Don't stop at the good part," Caleb protested, sprawled on the porch boards at my feet, his lanky form showing signs of the growth spurt that would soon transform him from boy to young man. "Your brother or sister objects to pirates today?" I laughed, feeling another emphatic kick. "She's practicin' to be a sheriff," Caleb declared, with the authority of an 11-year-old who had decided without evidence that he was getting a sister. My grandmother, settled comfortably in the adjacent rocking chair, smiled at our exchange. Her extended visit, initially planned for 2 weeks around the wedding, had stretched through summer and fall, then winter and spring, as she found herself increasingly reluctant to return east. "Perhaps I'll find a small house in town," she had mentioned just yesterday. "Summers here, winters in Boston, a sensible compromise." The idea of having her permanent presence in our lives filled me with quiet joy. After decades of separation, every moment together felt precious, a reclaiming of time stolen from us. Joshua worked nearby, his skilled hands crafting a cradle from cherry wood, brought at considerable expense from Denver. The rhythmic sounds of his sanding provided gentle counterpoint to my reading and the distant lowing of cattle in the home pasture. Redemption Creek had flourished alongside our family this past year. The library, established with my grandmother's generous funding and housed in a new addition to the schoolhouse, had become the pride of the community. Its shelves now held over 300 volumes. A modest collection by Boston standards, but a treasure trove in this frontier town. The brass plaque beside its door read simply, "Education is the path to freedom." 4 young women had already benefited from the scholarship fund, receiving support to pursue teacher training or nursing studies in Denver. Each had committed to returning to serve in smaller communities, extending the reach of our educational mission beyond Redemption Creek itself. "Do you ever miss Boston?" Joshua asked, pausing in his work, sawdust clinging to his forearms and sprinkling his dark hair with premature silver. I looked up from my book, considering his question honestly. I followed his gaze across our expanded property, the thriving vegetable garden, the new barn, the cottonwood trees we had planted along the drive that would someday provide shade for our children's children. Then I looked at my family gathered around me, the son of my heart, already showing signs of the good man he would become. The husband whose steadfast love had healed wounds I hadn't recognized until they stopped hurting. The grandmother restored to me against all odds. And the child growing beneath my heart, connecting past to future. "This is where I belong," I answered simply. "This is where I found not just redemption, but myself." As twilight gathered around our mountain home, we moved inside for evening prayers, a ritual begun on our wedding night and maintained through seasons of plenty and challenge alike. Gathered around the hearth, our voices blended in gratitude for journeys ended and beginnings yet to come. Outside our windows, the first stars appeared above Redemption Creek, where a frightened young woman had once stepped from a train with false papers and a desperate plan. How little she had understood about the true meaning of wealth, of family, of belonging. As Joshua's deep voice led our prayer of thanksgiving, his hand warm against mine, I silently added my own petition of gratitude for unanswered prayers and unexpected blessings, for a promise made on the prairie that had been fulfilled beyond my wildest dreams.